Tonight, voting illegally in Texas might get you 20 years in prison.
All kinds of voting mistakes would be criminalized under this law.
Somebody that made an honest mistake would not face harsh punishment.
The legislature debates moving voter fraud from a misdemeanor to a felony. The concerns over strengthening the punishment for illegal voting. Plus, tackling the Texas teacher shortage, the steps educators are urging lawmakers to take to fix the problem. And later,
the leader of Texas should be a presidential candidate every cycle. That's not always the case, but it should be.
Will a Texan run for the White House in 2024? For the first time in half a decade, the Lone Star State could be absent from the race for president. Capitol Tonight starts right now. Thanks for joining us here on Capitol Tonight. I'm Karina Kling. It was a tense scene at the Texas Capitol 2 years ago when lawmakers squared off over a sweeping GOP elections bill. Now, Republicans want to go further. Under the latest legislation filed by 2 Houston area lawmakers, the state would have more power when it comes to replacing local elections administrators. It's in response to Harris County's problems at the polls in recent elections. If passed, the Secretary of State would have the authority to step in and suspend county election administrators when a complaint is filed. They could also appoint a replacement. Currently, the Secretary of State's office serves as a guide and resource for election workers. This legislation gives them the power to investigate and fire them. Republican lawmakers also want to raise the penalty of illegal voting to a felony. It's a priority of Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, despite there being no evidence of widespread voter fraud. But as our Charlotte Scott reports, today lawmakers in the Senate quickly advanced such a proposal along party lines.
Texas election officials say the November election ran smoothly. More than 8 million Texans cast a ballot, and there was no widespread evidence of voter fraud.
Voting bill
Still, a group of Republican lawmakers is trying to make sure anyone who does vote illegally is charged with a felony.
Ignorance of the law is not a defense.
After hearing hours of public testimony, a Texas Senate committee voted to advance legislation that could lead to 20 years in prison. During the last legislative session, Governor Greg Abbott signed Senate Bill 1 into law.
Election integrity is now law in the state of Texas.
It changed how and where Texans could vote, but hidden within the bill was an amendment that lowered the penalty for illegal voting from a felony to a misdemeanor.
This was probably one issue that should not have been happened in the omnibus bill that did.
Houston Republican Senator Paul Betancourt says the bill simply aims to reverse the law to how it was before, but opponents say it's excessive.
There was no huge flood of illegal attempted voting in the last election when it was a Class A misdemeanor. This indicates to me that there's no reason to raise it back up to a felony.
Emily E.B. French is a staff attorney with the Texas Civil Rights Project.
You should not have to be a lawyer in order to safely vote without fear of imprisonment.
She says the bill could potentially punish people for making an honest mistake at the ballot box.
This will make people less likely to vote because they're afraid of being criminalized.
But Senator Betancourt says this law is meant to stop serious voting crimes. And he doesn't think it'll scare off voters since the punishment was a felony for decades.
Voter participation was off the scale. We had the highest turnout ever that we had in 2020 with the old penalty in place.
A push by Republicans to restore the penalty as Democrats and voting rights groups push back. For Capitol Tonight, I'm Charlotte Scott.
In a major security lapse, the state shipped thousands of Texas driver's licenses to a Chinese organized crime group that targeted Asian Texans. That's according to the head of the Department of Public Safety. Director Steve McCraw told a Texas House committee today the organization was able to get its hands on the licenses by pulling personal data on individuals with Asian surnames from the dark web. It was then used to request replacement licenses from the state using that data. The group then sold them to people in the country illegally. Officials say no state systems were hacked. DPS is working with federal agencies, and the investigation spans at least 4 states. Let's get a check now of some of the other political stories making headlines across Texas. Texans as young as 18 can now carry concealed weapons on public college campuses, in some businesses, and across state lines. The Texas Department of Public Safety announced the change in January. The minimum age used to be 21 until a federal judge struck down the age restrictions last year. According to the Dallas Morning News, DPS has received more than 100 applications from newly eligible young adults and issued 17 licenses. Texas abortion funds cannot face criminal charges for helping people get abortions out of state. This comes after a federal judge ruled against Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton and several county prosecutors on Friday. Meanwhile, a different federal judge based in Texas is expected to rule this week on a lawsuit that could ban a medication used in more than half of U.S. abortions for more than 20 years. And a Democratic state lawmaker wants to pay future state legislators the same salary as public school teachers. State lawmakers earn $7,200 a year, which has not changed since 1975. But Austin area Representative Gina Hinojosa told the Texas Tribune being a state legislator is a full-time job, and tying their pay to teachers' pay would give lawmakers a living wage and encourage more people to run for office. Her proposed constitutional amendment needs to pass in the legislature before voters would have the chance to approve it. Texas has a teacher shortage, and Friday, a task force ordered by the governor to look at how to fix that released its recommendations to state lawmakers. The group was a mix of educators and school administrators and zeroed in on 3 areas: increased teacher salaries. Currently, teacher pay is close to $8,000 less than the national average. Improve training and commit to respecting teachers' time. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated the state's teacher shortage, but teachers have also cited being caught in the crossfire of the state's culture wars as reasons for leaving the profession. With us now to discuss these recommendations further is Monty Exter. He's a lobbyist for the Association of Texas Professional Educators. Monty, welcome back to the program. Nice to see you.
Thanks. Nice to see you too.
Lawmakers are looking at a nearly $33 billion budget surplus. So there is talk about raising teacher pay, doing things like that. I mean, how best is that accomplished?
So, first of all, I think it's important for us to recognize that the $33 billion you're talking about, some of that is perhaps one-time funding, but some of that is just normal increases in the state budget that we can expect to see session after session. So it's very appropriate to do some ongoing expenditures like teacher pay with that money. How you best structure that? Well, at least some of those funds need to be spent on increasing base pay, really an across-the-board pay raise for all of our teachers. And once we get to a level where base pay is really adequate, then we can start to talk about layering on other forms of incentive pay or differentiated pay on top of that.
Monty, I know that you've been an outspoken opponent of school vouchers, and of course this comes as private school vouchers are being pushed by Governor Abbott. I mean, the governor is saying both can be done. What's your response to that?
So right now we are in the bottom of all states across the country of what we spend on a per pupil basis. Our funding has been relatively flat. We talked about just today in a House hearing about how districts spend about $2 billion more than they're given on special ed funding. You mentioned a second ago the disparities that we have in teacher pay versus folks across the country. It's even worse when you think about the fact that folks with equivalent degrees can expect 25% more than if they were to become a teacher. So as long as we have all of those needs from a financial standpoint here in the state, trying to talk about how we can fund 2 different systems seems illogical, certainly inefficient, and really just isn't supported by the history of how we do state funding in Texas.
Beyond the raises and some of the various aspects of the teacher pay, the task force also recommending more training as a way to support and retain teachers. One of the things they mentioned was having the state fund teacher residency program similar to the medical field. How likely is that, and how helpful would that be?
So I am somewhat encouraged that there are a lot of our leadership folks who are talking about things like teacher residencies. I think that a teacher residency as part, maybe the capstone of a high quality educator preparation program is a fantastic idea. It's something that we've been talking about for years, in addition to raising the overall quality of educator preparation. And it's something that really seems to be working well in the pockets where we're already doing it. One of the things that we found is the more prepared you are going into the classroom as a first-year teacher, the more likely you are to actually stay in the profession, and the better you're going to do and the more quickly you're going to do better for your students.
Money Extra will have to leave it there. We'll see how lawmakers begin to tackle some of these recommendations, and we'll get you back on to discuss it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Turning now to higher education, the U.S. Supreme Court will hear arguments tomorrow on President Biden's student debt relief plan. 2 cases challenging the program will go before the justices. Karen Kaifa is in Washington with more.
In limbo for months, President Joe Biden's federal student loan relief plan will have a turn before the U.S. Supreme Court Tuesday. Last August, Biden unveiled a sweeping plan to forgive up to $20,000 in federal student loan debt for borrowers whose income was less than $125,000 a year.
All this means people can finally crawl out from under that mountain of debt to get on top of their rent and their utilities.
Supporters lauded the move as a big step forward to ending a college debt crisis compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the Biden administration said among borrowers no longer in school, nearly 90% of relief dollars would go to those earning less than $75,000 a year. Republican critics called it political, landing as the 2022 midterm elections entered the home stretch, and argued writing off an estimated $430 billion in repayments should get congressional approval. In December, the Supreme Court agreed to take up 2 challenges to the plan, including one from 6 GOP-led states, Nebraska, Arkansas, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, and South Carolina, while keeping a block imposed by an appeals court last November in place. Millions of borrowers have been notified they're approved for debt relief. No debt has been canceled yet. The Biden administration's case leans on the post-9/11 HEROES Act of 2003, which granted the U.S. Secretary of Education authority to make changes to the federal student loan program during national emergencies. But the White House intends to end the COVID-19 national emergency on May 11th, which may make that argument more challenging. In Washington, I'm Karen Kaifa.
Still to come on Capitol tonight, the 2024 race for the White House may have a Texas-sized hole, why a 50-year streak of presidential contenders could end. Plus, how the school choice fight could play into one lawmaker's political future. Welcome back. Every presidential race in the last 50 years has included at least one candidate from Texas, reflecting the state's political importance. But as our Washington reporter Rena Diamante explains, it appears that streak may end.
Since 1953, 4 men who were born or lived in Texas have become president, and many others from the Lone Star State have sought the job.
Texas is, if it was on its own, among the top 25 economies of the entire world if it was own country. So obviously the person who runs that state gets a lot of experience, or at the very least gets a lot of credit for having a lot of experience.
The 2024 presidential race has begun to take shape, but for the first time since 1972, it is possible that no Texan will officially enter the ring.
I'd be extremely disappointed if that turns out to be the case. Texas represents the country super well, and we've had a lot of characters as governor or senator over the years, and I think that they play well on the national stage.
Senator Ted Cruz's White House ambitions are no secret, but after failing to win the GOP nomination in 2016, he says he's focused on re-election next year. Former Republican Congressman Will Hurd of San Antonio may run. Governor Greg Abbott recently sidestepped a Capitol Tonight question about whether his border policies set him up for a presidential bid.
I'm focused only on this session this year and only on the state of Texas.
As for the Democrats, Beto O'Rourke and Julian Castro's candidacies fell short in 2020, and their Texas bench is now so thin. George C., a Dallas-based investor and political donor, supported Republicans Mitt Romney, Rick Perry, and Marco Rubio for president. He hopes Abbott runs too.
Texas is now the second largest state. We're going to pass California within 20 to 30 years. So the leader of Texas should be a presidential candidate every cycle. That's not always the case, but it should be.
Whoever is running for president, whether from Texas or not, you really do have to come through this state either to get support or to open your wallet.
There is still time for a Texan to run, and we should get more clarity after this year's state legislative session. Under state rules, Senator Cruz could run for re-election in the White House at the same time, but that could be difficult politically to do so. In Washington, Rena Diamante, Capitol Tonight.
And we want to bring in the Quorum Report's Harvey Kronberg now. Harvey, good to see you as always.
Pleasure, Karina.
How likely do you think it is that Texas will not be represented in the 2024 presidential race?
I'd call it about a 95% probability at the moment. Although I will say that the governor, despite what he just said, is trying to put himself in position should there be a vacancy. If Donald Trump doesn't run, if DeSantis stumbles, there's very few people that have the capacity to raise $100 million in nothing flat, and this governor has demonstrated, if nothing else, he is one of the premier fundraisers in the country.
Yeah, I guess if Donald Trump were to get out of the race. I mean, with, as you're mentioning, with how he's positioning himself and his legislative agenda, how likely do you think that is? I mean, with what he's saying and on this, during this session, how likely do you think it is that the governor jumps in, or is it all tied to how well these things do in the legislative session?
Oh, I think Texas has already marginalized itself in a number of different ways in national policy based on culture wars, if nothing else. Polling shows banning books is extraordinarily unpopular among both Democrats and independents. And you can go down the list, abortion law with no exceptions. If we had a serious Democratic candidate in the last election, I doubt that it would have been a 12-point spread between the Democrat and the Republican because abortion proved to be a decisive issue in stopping the anticipated red wave. So I think it would actually be a relatively not difficult to win the Republican primary, but the general election is a very different matter. And I would toss in Senator Cruz. Has some pretty viable opposition this time. The odds of him making it through the presidential primary are remote. And as I've said before on this station, I do believe that he's eyeing the governorship if Abbott decides to retire, not run again. And he would be formidable much more formidable in a Texas primary than he would be in a national primary.
Sure. Yeah. Interesting. We'll see how all that plays out. How do you think the school choice, and when talking about Governor Abbott, fits into this? I mean, if he were to get that across the finish line, or even just doesn't get across the finish line, and what you're seeing with this issue right now as he tries to push this as a top priority?
Well, they're selling a false premise right now. They're saying it's popular among rural Republicans. Scott Braddock, my editor at the Quorum Report, went to Corsicana where he was making a presentation today. The House member that introduced him never mentioned vouchers, only how much funding the legislature has put into education over the last several cycles. The governor got no applause when he mentioned vouchers. The only applause he really got, the only amen, and was essentially when he had talked about getting rid of the woke liberal agenda in the schools. I think that if it does pass, we will see a number of rural Republican House members not coming back.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, we just have about 30 seconds left, but do you see there being any kind of carve out or anything? I asked him this on the show when he was on last week, but for rural areas, or just it really needs to be pushed as
it doesn't make any difference. The carve out doesn't make any difference. The hold harmless is the only thing that makes any difference. If you can guarantee them the same dollars per pupil, which would, along with the vouchers, would massively expand the money we're already spending. There's a reason that the governor's budget did not include any additional expenditures for vouchers. And if you go back to the 2015 bill that came out of the Texas Senate, which is sort of the model here, there's a fiscal note, tells you how much it's going to cost. Yeah. They left it blank.
Harvey Kronberg, we will discuss more next week. Thank you so much.
Pretty darned interesting. It's a session.
Still ahead on Capitol tonight, what started the COVID-19 pandemic? How government officials are trying to get answers. In Washington, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are demanding answers after a report from a federal agency says that new intelligence could indicate COVID-19 leaked from a lab in China. Washington correspondent Torian Small has the story.
U.S. government officials are divided on what started the COVID-19 pandemic 9 months after President Joe Biden ordered the U.S. intel community get definitive answers.
The intelligence community is working through getting to the bottom of this, as the president has directed and as the president wants to see.
Some U.S. agencies have concluded the COVID pandemic likely began naturally. The virus was transmitted from an animal to humans. But over the weekend, the Wall Street Journal first reported the Energy Department now believes with, quote, low confidence that a lab leak was likely the cause of the outbreak. The White House Monday did not confirm the report, but said the investigation is still ongoing.
What the president wants is facts. He wants the whole government designed to go get those facts. And that's what we're doing. And we're just not there yet.
The Capitol Hill grows impatient.
We were derided, we were ridiculed, as have other members of Congress.
Pointing to the new report, House Republicans called out Democrats for previously slamming their push for the government to explore the lab leak theory sooner. Monday, the chairman of the House Select Committee on China, Representative Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin, demanded the Biden administration declassify all intel on the virus's origins. Gallagher's Democratic colleague on the committee, Seth Moulton of Massachusetts, says the U.S. shouldn't let China off the hook.
The Chinese have mishandled COVID at every step of the way. Trying to sweep it under the rug, trying to try a strategy of zero COVID that utterly failed.
Although President Joe Biden back in May asked the intel community to report back on the virus's origins within 90 days, the White House says there isn't an updated timeline for when this investigation will conclude. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby says the U.S. has been unsuccessfully trying to get China to cooperate, making it hard to get those definitive answers. In Washington, Torian Small, Capitol Tonight.
San Antonio Congressman Joaquin Castro announced today he has cancer, but he underwent successful surgery to remove intestinal tumors. He says doctors discovered small, mostly asymptomatic tumors in his GI tract last summer. He released a statement that reads in part, quote, "My prognosis is good. I expect to be home recovering in Texas for several weeks before returning to Washington to continue my work on behalf of the people of my hometown, San Antonio." We wish him a quick and speedy recovery. That is all the time that we have tonight. We're back again tomorrow with the latest in Texas politics. Until then, thanks for watching. Stay safe and have a great night.